Okay, welcome to the deep dive. You brought us a really interesting starting point today. This idea of making a documentary about Gaza.
Yeah, it sounds straightforward enough on the surface.
Right, make me a documentary about Gaza. That simple phrase.
But, as we get into the sources you shared, it becomes clear pretty quickly that this simple request bumps up against a reality that's incredibly complex and, frankly, just devastating.
Exactly. We're working with three main sources you gave us. First, there are some notes that look at the very beginning of this documentary concept, how the idea itself kind of came about. Then we have a really detailed World Bank report. This one's from December 2024, and it gives a deep, data-heavy look at the economic and humanitarian situation on the ground.
A lot of hard numbers in that one.
Definitely. And third, there's an article from the Carney Endowment, published back in February 2024. This one focuses specifically on how the conflict is impacting culture and identity in Gaza.
Right, adding another crucial layer to the story.
So our mission here is pretty clear. We're going to walk through these sources, unpack the key points they make, and really try to understand the huge gap between that initial simple concept of documenting Gaza and the profound, multi-layered reality these reports actually describe.
And just to be clear, we're sticking only to the material you provided for this.
Absolutely. Only what's in these documents. Okay, let's dive in.
Sounds good. Where do we start?
Let's start at the beginning, with the Gaza Documentary Project Genesis notes. They describe the foundational concept as this undated idea, apparently from some anonymous source, just to, create a documentary about Gaza.
Okay. And you mentioned that simple phrase.
Yeah, you see it pop up in two different documents mentioned in the notes. A Gaza documentary proposal and also a separate new note. Both just have that core directive, make me a documentary about Gaza.
That's it. No more detail.
Nope. And that's exactly what the internal analysis, which is in a briefing document, pointed out immediately. It flagged the proposal as being in, quote, very nascent stages.
Nascent stages. Okay.
Because there was basically zero detail beyond that simple command. The analysis stressed that way more information was needed just to even start thinking about it.
So, a clear instruction, but completely lacking substance at that point.
Precisely. And it seems these initial documents themselves then got studied. There's mention of a Gaza documentary project study guide.
Right, which was apparently created just to analyze these very basic documents. It even had, quiz questions and a glossary.
So they were studying the lack of information.
It seems that way. It really highlights how this initial, simple concept was immediately seen internally as needing a lot more fleshing out.
And the cast of characters identified in these early notes is interesting too. They aren't named individuals, really.
No, they're defined entirely by their relationship to these documents we're talking about. The author of the proposal, the author of the new note, the author of the briefing document, the authors of the study guide.
And the implied filmmaker or producer who is supposed to receive this bare bones directive.
Yeah. So what this initial source really tells us is that the project started with a simple goal, but right away, the internal process recognized this huge gap between the idea and the actual detailed reality needed to make it happen.
Which sets up our next source perfectly, and it hits with quite some force. We're shifting now from that abstract idea of documenting Gaza to the incredibly concrete and honestly grim picture presented in the World Bank report from December 2024.
Okay, the impacts of the conflict in the Middle East on the Palestinian economy.
That's the one. And this report delivers exactly the kind of detailed reality that initial documentary concept was missing. It really lays bare the scale of the economic and humanitarian catastrophe.
Okay, so what are the key takeaways?
Well, starting with the human cost, the executive summary reports staggering numbers. As of mid-November 2024, over 43,000 fatalities and 102,000 injuries reported in Gaza.
Just devastating numbers.
And the report notes specifically that, reportedly, more than half of these are women, children, and the elderly.
Wow, and displacement.
Massive. We're talking nearly the entire population of Gaza, an estimated 1.9 million people. That's about 90% internally displaced.
90%.
Yeah, and many of them have been forced to move multiple times. The report mentions some up to 10 times. They're living in these incredibly overcrowded shelters, averaging just 1.5 square meters per person.
1.5 square meters per person. I can barely picture that.
It's incredibly tight. And the physical destruction is just as widespread. As of that same time, mid-November 2024, the report states over 80% of commercial facilities are destroyed or severely damaged.
80% of businesses.
70% of the road network. And close to 90% of housing units.
90% of homes.
destroyed or severely damaged. It highlights an urgent need for basic shelter and winterization support for about 1.34 million people.
Just basic survival needs. And does it mention the West Bank?
It does. It touches on the spillover effects, the increased violence, for example. The UN documented over 1,500 settler-Palestinian clashes since October 7, 2023. This has led to displacement, too. Over 1,600 Palestinians in the West Bank displaced, and major disruptions to public services, like education, affecting hundreds of thousands of students.
So the impact is broader, even if the scale is different.
Right. Now, turning to the economy itself, the report uses the term unmatched contraction.
Unmatched? That sounds serious.
It is. The West Bank's economy contracted significantly, 23% in the first half of 2024 compared to the year before, which is huge.
Yeah, that's a major recession.
But Gaza, the economy there contracted by a shocking 86% in the same period.
86%.
86%.
Yeah.
The overall output for the Palestinian territories in 2024 was projected to decline by 26%.
An 86% contraction? I mean, that basically means economic activity has just stopped in Gaza.
Pretty much. The report estimates the business cycle index there was effectively zero in the third quarter of 2024.
Zero?
Yeah. Key sectors just collapsed. Construction down over 98%, manufacturing down almost 95%, wholesale and retail trade down over 96% in the first half of 2024 compared to 2023.
Unbelievable declines across the board.
The report uses stark language. It says Gaza's economy plunged into a, quote, never-seen-before recession.
Never seen before. And what about income for people?
Also grim. The World Bank notes per capita income in Gaza, which was around $2,300 back in 1994, is estimated to have fallen below $200 today, based on their recent data.
From over $2,000 to under $200, that's just a complete wipeout of livelihoods.
And the private sector itself is decimated. As of October 2024, the report says 88% of business establishments in Gaza were damaged or destroyed.
Almost 9 out of 10.
Yeah, 66% totally destroyed, 22% partially damaged. And it shows this damage progressing across different sectors: industry, trade, tourism, services getting worse between February and October 2024.
So it's not just that things were bad, they were actively getting worse over that period.
Exactly. And this obviously devastates the labor market. Unemployment is described as severe. The number of Palestinian workers who could get permits to work in Israel plummeted.
Right, I remember seeing numbers on that.
Yeah, from around 177,000 before October 2023, down to only about 27,000 in the second quarter of 2024.
A huge drop. That's a major source of income gone.
Absolutely. And the report also notes a rise in informal work in Gaza, which includes, concerningly, the involvement of children.
That's heartbreaking.
Meanwhile, in the West Bank, even for those who still have jobs, wages reportedly fell by about 20%.
So less work and lower pay. A double hit.
Right. Then there are the market conditions inside Gaza. Prices have just exploded. The CPI, the Consumer Price Index,
The measure of inflation.
was up over 300% year over year in October 2024.
300% inflation.
And get this, food prices specifically were up over 440%.
440% for food. How can anyone afford to eat?
Well, that's the thing. Combined with acute shortages of basic goods, vegetables, fruits, meat, and market closures like in Rafah, it severely limits people's ability to buy anything, even if they had money.
Which they likely don't, given the economic collapse.
Exactly. The report mentions irregular supply chains, monopolies cropping up, a severe cash shortage, people resorting to black market withdrawals with huge commissions.
Wow. It's a completely broken market.
And it starkly contrasts with the West Bank, where the CPI increase was much lower, around 2%.
So a huge disparity there. This must lead to food insecurity.
A crisis. The report cites the IPC, that's the Integrated Food Security Phase Classification System.
Right, the international standard.
It states that 91% of Gaza's population, 1.9 million people, were on the brink of acute food insecurity as of the report date.
91%, almost everyone.
Yeah. It notes an elevated risk of famine, especially in the north. Over 875,000 people were facing emergency levels, that's IPC Phase 4, and 345,000 were at catastrophic levels, Phase 5.
Catastrophic is the highest level, right? Basically famine conditions.
Yes, and it highlights the severe nutrition crisis among the most vulnerable children, pregnant women, with over 96% lacking even minimum dietary diversity.
So awful. What about other basic infrastructure?
Communications also devastated. Widespread mobile and internet outages due to the destruction. This disrupts emergency services, life-saving information, and just makes everything harder for people already suffering.
And Gaza already had limited connectivity before, right?
Yeah, the report mentions pre-existing limits. Only 3G in the West Bank, just 2G in Gaza, no mobile broadband. And as of October 4th, 2024, it says over 1,300 ICT facilities were impacted, 1082 destroyed, 250 partially damaged.
So the limited infrastructure they had is now largely gone.
Right. Private telecom operators are trying their best, according to the report, repairing sites, using generators, even deploying mobile towers on trucks and providing free services.
But that must be costing them a fortune.
Huge financial losses, yeah. Lost revenue from Gaza, plus all the extra costs. And this spills over, impacting their operations in the West Bank too. The report also specifically mentions the psychological toll of this digital isolation.
I can only imagine. What about electricity?
Requires extensive repair and replacement. The distribution network, transformers, cables, meters, solar panels, even parts of the Gaza power plant and high-voltage connection points, all heavily damaged or destroyed.
So basically the whole system needs rebuilding.
Pretty much. The losses have crippled services, slashed productivity, increased costs, and forced reliance on, polluting generators. The report outlines recovery priorities. Immediate needs like fixing distribution lines and getting off-grid solar working, and medium-term goals like repairing the power plant and fuel imports.
Okay. So massive damage across the board. What about the Palestinian Authority's finances? How are they coping?
They face enormous fiscal challenges. The report points to an escalating deficit through 2024. This is driven by increased Israeli deductions from clearance revenues.
Those are the taxes Israel collects on behalf of the PA.
Correct. And also reduced domestic revenue collection. As a result, the PA has only been able to pay about 60–70% of public sector salaries since late 2023.
60 to 70%. That affects a lot of families.
Huge impact. Their financing needs reached over $1 billion just in the first 10 months of 2024. International aid hasn't filled the gap.
So how are they managing?
The report says the PA is relying heavily on borrowing from domestic banks and accumulating arrears, basically, unpaid bills. The estimated budget deficit for 2024, even after aid and those deductions, was projected at $1.2 billion.
That sounds unsustainable. What about the banks themselves? You mentioned the PA is borrowing from them.
Right. The report says the Palestinian financial sector overall remains robust on paper, well-capitalized, liquid, decent capital adequacy ratio.
Okay, so the system isn't collapsing.
Not the system overall, but they are facing significant challenges. Expected credit losses, reduced profits, operational difficulties, and the impact in Gaza is catastrophic for banking.
How so?
Virtually all bank branches and ATMs there are non-operational. Out of 57 head offices or branches in Gaza, 33 were destroyed and 19 partially damaged as of the report date.
So people can't access banks or cash machines even if they had money in an account.
Makes it incredibly difficult. And the bank's exposure to the PA is significant direct loans. Plus, loans to PA employees make up about 37% of their total credit. Profitability for the banks declined significantly in 2024.
Okay. There's also something about correspondent banking, right? CBRs?
Yes, correspondent banking relationships. These are crucial, the report explains, because the Palestinian economy uses the Israeli shekel, but doesn't have its own central bank managing it in the same way.
So they need Israeli banks to facilitate transactions.
Exactly. Facilitated via Israeli commercial banks and the Bank of Israel. Now, to shield the Israeli banks from potential risks, the Israeli government issues indemnity letters. These were set to expire but got extended recently, from November 2024 to November 2025.
Okay, so that provides some stability for now.
For now, but the report stresses the need for a more stable, long-term cross-border framework, including sorting out the chronic issue of physically getting cash back out of Israel and into Palestinian banks.
Right. So after laying all this out, what does the World Bank say needs to happen? What are the main recommendations?
The absolute top priority, stated clearly, is ending the hostilities.
Makes sense. Nothing can really happen without that.
Nothing sustainable, no. Beyond that, key recommendations include reversing those unilateral deductions of clearance revenues and transferring the withheld funds back to the PA.
Okay, fiscal measures.
And a call for the international community to significantly increase funding.
More aid is needed.
Definitely. Then there are measures to support recovery on the ground, helping generate income, facilitating trade, bolstering the private sector.
Trying to rebuild the economy.
And finally, the report also notes the need for Palestinian decision-makers themselves to accelerate urgent reforms, things related to governance, transparency, and making their finances more sustainable long-term.
Right, internal reforms too. So, okay, this World Bank report provides this incredibly detailed, stark picture of the physical, human, and economic devastation. It's the overwhelming what's happening on the ground in data terms.
Exactly. Which brings us logically to the third source you provided. The Carnegie Endowment article from February 2024 titled Vanishing Ink: Palestinian Culture Under Threat in Gaza.
Okay, shifting focus now to culture.
Yeah, and this piece adds another absolutely essential dimension to understanding what documenting Gaza would really entail. It focuses on the devastating impact the conflict is having on cultural life and identity.
So beyond the physical and economic destruction.
Right. The article argues very strongly that the conflict isn't just destroying buildings and livelihoods, it's actively tearing apart the cultural fabric of Gaza.
How does it illustrate that?
It gives specific and frankly heartbreaking examples. Major cultural institutions, like the Rashad al-Shoa Cultural Center and the Al-Qarara Museum, have been destroyed.
Important community hubs, gone.
And the human loss in the cultural sphere is also highlighted. The article states that at least 28 Palestinian artists and writers had been killed by the time it was written. This includes well-known poets and academics like Rafat El-Arir and Dr. Sufyan Taya, but also young, emerging talents.
That's a direct loss of voices and creativity.
Absolutely. And the article quotes the Palestinian Minister of Culture, making a very pointed statement. The war on culture has always been at the heart of the aggressor's war on our people.
So framing the cultural destruction as intentional, as part of the conflict's core.
Exactly. The article emphasizes this multi-layered nature of the impact, saying it goes beyond just physical damage to actively undermine heritage, identity, and existence itself, with global implications.
Okay, so how does the physical destruction contribute to that deeper undermining?
Well, the loss of historical narratives is a key point. When universities and archives are destroyed, it means the loss of irreplaceable resources, things like centuries-old manuscripts that are essential for understanding Gaza's cultural history and evolution.
So erasing the records of the past.
Precisely. And damage to artifacts and archaeological treasures is mentioned too, like a collection of Byzantine-era pottery and a Roman cemetery that had rare lead caskets. Tangible links to a long history, damaged or lost.
It's not just recent history being affected then.
No, it's deep history too. And the article highlights the symbolic impact of targeting ancient sites like mosques and churches.
Why symbolic?
Because these aren't just places of worship. The article describes them as symbols of deep historical and religious significance. Vessels of faith, tradition, local architecture, and importantly, evidence of Gaza's long history of interfaith coexistence. Destroying them attacks that symbolism.
Right, it attacks the story they tell about Gaza's past.
Exactly, and the analysis in the article takes this further. It posits that this destruction isn't random, but serves a larger agenda. The erasure of Palestinian identity and collective memory. It even suggests this could potentially amount to cultural genocide.
Okay, that's a very strong term. How does the article explain that connection?
It draws on the concept, mentioning definitions like Raphael Lemkin's original work on genocide, where cultural genocide efforts to erase a group's culture, language, religion is seen as a component of broader genocide. It presents genocide not just as killing, but as a systematic process of destruction.
So destroying culture is part of destroying the group itself.
That's the argument presented. The article links this erasure of culture to an active dehumanization, connecting it to dehumanizing language reportedly used during the conflict.
Dehumanization making destruction seem more permissible.
That's the implication. It also points to South Africa's application to the International Court of Justice regarding the situation, noting that the application specifically highlighted the destruction of official memory and records, as well as private memories, histories, and futures in Gaza as part of its case.
So connecting the physical destruction to the erasure of both collective and personal history.
Yes, and the psychological impact of all this is described as profound and enduring, not just for the survivors living through it in Gaza, but also for the Palestinian diaspora around the world.
How so?
Because erasing cultural identity, erasing those tangible links to heritage and the past, creates new traumas, potentially lasting for generations. There's a quote from artist Bashar Murad that captures this well. He says, "There's also a mental war and a war on our identities."
A war on identity itself.
That's the core idea. It's presented as an attack on who people are, fundamentally, not just where they live or what they own. The article concludes with a call to action, urging the global literary and artistic community to step up to help preserve and amplify these Palestinian voices that are being silenced.
So this source adds that critical context of identity, memory, and the alleged deliberate targeting of culture itself. It puts a layer of profound, intangible loss on top of the already devastating economic and humanitarian picture from the World Bank report.
Absolutely. So if we look back at this deep dive, thinking about the sources you brought us, we started with that incredibly simple, almost stark directive. Make me a documentary about Gaza.
Just that one sentence.
Yeah. And then we plunged into the sources describing the reality, the overwhelming, multifaceted depth of what's happening, according to World Bank report and the Carnegie article.
The immense human catastrophe, the sheer scale of physical devastation and economic collapse described as unlike anything seen before.
And layered on top of that, this account of the deliberate targeting of culture, of identity, of memory itself.
It creates this stark, almost jarring contrast between that initial vague directive and the sheer weight and complexity of the situation on the ground as detailed in these reports.
It really does. And it leaves you thinking, when you're faced with destruction on this scale, homes, roads, hospitals, businesses, archives, museums, mosques, churches, the entire economy, the very symbols and records of identity and history.
How does the act of documenting, of trying to tell that story, change? What does it even take to truly capture the depth of that reality, that level of human and cultural devastation based on the kind of information presented in these reports?
Does the very act of trying to document in circumstances like these become something more than just reporting? Does it become, perhaps, as the Carnegie article implies, a form of resistance against that very erasure it's trying to capture?
It certainly leaves you with a powerful question about the weight, the responsibility, and maybe even the inherent purpose behind that initial, simple idea of making a documentary.